Hello, Alex here, and in this video I'm going to talk about the Rollei Colorchem C-41 kit for developing color negative film at home and what you need to know about it in terms of safety, handling and disposal. This video was sponsored by the folks at thephotoshop.ie who have partnered with me for this educational video and video series on photographic chemical safety. We'll talk about them later on in the video, but for now, let's get into it. As always, I have to start with some legal disclaimers. The opinions expressed within this video are my professionally educated opinions. I have a PhD in chemistry and my job focuses heavily on chemical waste management at an industrial scale. But these are just my opinions and they don't constitute legal advice on behalf of myself or the folks at thephotoshop.ie, and they don't overrule or supersede your local laws or regulations in any way. If you have general questions, feel free to drop me an email, drop a comment down below, or send me a DM on Instagram or Discord and I'll get back to you when I can. But if you have any pressing, urgent matters, make sure you reach out to your council, city, or other regulatory board instead. And now we pull back the veil. This video has taken me forever to write. We're really breaking the fourth wall here. I'm talking very directly to you. I expect your patience with this video because these SDSs tend to be around 10 to 15 pages long. This one is just shy of 100 pages long and it's not a searchable PDF. I won't say this video has broken me, but it is a drastic amount of work and I'm really like being honest and blunt about this kind of thing here. What else did I have to say? Let's check the notes. I'm hoping that by front loading all this work now, I've basically built a template that I can use in the future and I have made some changes to the template. So I want your feedback to see if this is working right. You know, this is going to be a very long video no matter what I do, just because there's so much to cover. The chemical composition section, I recommend a lot of people skip if you're not really interested in how the C-41 kits are actually designed and what the components do. And I'll point it out when we get to that part of the video because it's just a huge chunk of it and I would rather people get the practical information that comes after that in the format of these videos than get bored halfway through and just skip the rest of the video, you know? As we go through the video, I'm going to give the Rollei Colorchem C-41 kit a rating out of 3 for safety, handling, disposal, and of course, cost. And I'm also going to add in a new metric and I'm going to be grading the color chemicals in a completely different matrix that I use for black and white stuff, just because there's no way I can really integrate it while providing fine enough detail about the individual components in the developer kits. That'll make more sense when you see it later. I think that's all I have to say about the preamble. Yeah, so let's really get into it. The C-41 color negative process, introduced in 1972, replaces the older C-22 process, and it is the standard method for developing color negative print film. It is distinct from the ECN2 process for cinema films and the E6 process for color reversal slide films, and it is an absolutely standardized process which makes it magical. It is, with a limited exception, the exact same time for every film. You can shoot Adox Helios, FPP low ISO color, expired Natura 1600, Kodak Portra 400, shot at 200, Ilford XP2 all in one tank and develop them for the exact same time. This is why labs are able to offer things like 1 hour turnaround for C-41 processing with a mini lab, but not for black and white. I often get asked why this is, and short version for now, if you're designing a C-41 film, you know how it's going to be developed and you will tailor the design of your film to make sure it gives you, for example, or Wolfen with the NC200 film that's coming soon, or will have come out by the time this video comes out, you know that you want to get ISO 200 with that development time, so you design it in mind. It's like, I always go back to food analogies, it's like a microwave meal. If you know that you're telling the user to microwave this thing for 5 minutes at whatever wattage, you will part cook every component to make sure that they are finished at the same time. And that's what I'm kind of talking about with the individual layers developing to the right degree in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. In a lab, a batch of chemicals will be mixed and will be kind of aged artificially with a starter, and then after every certain number of rolls, they will discard a portion of that batch and add in a replenisher. This basically pre-ages the solution to a steady state, and then they will top it up to make sure basically not too much crap like halide salts accumulates or whatever gunk comes out of the film, to maintain consistent and optimum performance for a long period until that batch of chems does eventually get tossed. That isn't really how it works for most people at home. There are a couple of people out there who do replenishment for C-41 chemistry, but the vast majority of people don't. What happens with the majority of us, especially with a 1 liter kit like this, is we will take it, we will develop some film, and then per the instructions, we will extend the development time as we reuse that development solution, which is not one shot, so that we get decently good development that will not pass a control strip level of scrutiny, but is good enough for home use, you know. I get a lot of queries about that kind of thing as well. And it's like, yes, reusing the developer is wrong per the spec without a replenisher and without having used a starter in the first place. But chances are you're probably metering a little bit wrong as well, and the way you're going to be agitating the tank isn't going to be perfect. It's not the kind of fine detail you need to worry about. It's good enough for home use, and thousands, tens of thousands of people develop C-41 film at home this way, and it's perfectly fine. C-41 kits generally fall into one of 4 categories: powder versus liquid concentrates, and 2-bath versus 3-bath. There are 3 steps to the C-41 development process. The first is the actual development, where the latent image crystals react with the activated CD4 in the development solution, growing those silver nanoparticles in the 3 distinct emulsion layers, or 6 or more, but that's a whole other topic, to generate the metallic silver as well as the oxidized CD4, which will then react with the dicouplers present in those different layers at the sites of exposure and development to form the final dyes. So where you get exposure in the magenta forming layer, the oxidized CD4 will react with the dicouplers to form a magenta dye, for example. The second step is a bleaching step to reoxidize that metallic silver back to silver plus ionic silver salts so that it can be removed in the third step, which is a fixer. A lot of C-41 kits combine the bleach and fixing steps together into what's called Blix, and that reduces the number of processing steps from 2-ish plus a stabilizer, or from 3 plus a stabilizer down to just 2 steps. And it simplifies the overall process, but it's not my preference, as we'll get into later. So of those 4 types, the Rollei Colorchem C-41 kit is a 2-bath kit using liquid concentrates to prepare a 1 liter solution of the color developer and another 1 liter solution of the Blix. It's also available in a 5 liter pack size to make 5 liters of each solution, but that is by no means very popular. At least I don't really see people talking about it very often compared to the likes of the Fuji or Jobo 5 liter kits. Here I'm going to start with the developer concentrates, and again, this is the densest part of the video, so if you really just want the practical information about safety, handling and disposal and don't really care how these kits work, I would rather you skip this part and watch those parts than get bored again and just skip the rest of the video. So if you want to do that, just skip to this timestamp on screen now. Okay, still with me? Great. In developer part A, potassium carbonate at 25 to 50% is a weak base, ensuring that the working solution of the developer is at the appropriate pH of 10 to 10.1, and so serving as an activator for the developer. It also has a pKa, or acid dissociation constant, of 10.3, so it might provide some level of pH buffering to the working solution as it ages, specifically from carbonic acid formation from carbon dioxide dissolving in the developer, or the liberation of acidic byproducts from film during development. HEDTA at 2 to 5% is chemically similar to EDTA, and as best I can tell, it's just a chelating agent, binding and sequestering metal ions in the water that could otherwise interfere with the development process. Considering that DTPA is more effective at high pH than EDTA is, and C-41 Dev has a high pH of 10, I suspect that HEDTA is also more stable at elevated pH, hence its use here. In the specific case of C-41 processing, these chelating agents are targeted to bind calcium more than anything else and reduce water hardness, and there's a good reason for that. Etidronic acid at between 2 to 5-ish% is another chelating agent, but this has an extreme affinity for calcium, forming an insoluble precipitate similar in chemical structure to calcium phosphate, sort of a type of limescale in a very broad sense. So here, the HEDTA is actually removing some ions, but mainly the calcium, sequestering that to protect the editronic acid, which, as far as I can tell, is a significantly more potent chelating agent, and it's probably just not so common for regular processing because of its cost. Most of the references I can find to look at the relative binding affinities are dentistry articles, because it's used for dentistry because of the calcium affinity, so it's hard to find any concrete information, but as best I can tell, that's what the relationship is here. The second last thing is potassium hydroxide at between 0.5% to 2%, and this is a strong base that firmly elevates the pH and activates the developer as an accelerator. Lastly, we have potassium bromide at 0.5 to 2% as a restrainer, as bromide competes with all developers to bind to the growing silver crystals, and if the developer can't bind, like physically can't touch the silver crystals, it can't reduce the silver ions. This is used to balance the activity of the developer where you want it to react quickly with high speed without reacting in an uncontrolled way. This is very common for a lot of developers you see like HC110. Next, developer part B only has a single ingredient. Bis hydroxyammonium sulfate, or HAS, at about 2.5 to 5% is a stable salt of hydroxylamine or hydroxylamine, which is a potent reducing agent and an antioxidant preservative for color developer solutions, acting as a functional equivalent to sodium sulfite or metabisulfite that we would see in black and white developers. A lot of people actually do substitute in sodium sulfite when doing homebrew C-41, and this prolongs the shelf life of the working solution. Developer part C then also only has a single ingredient, color developing agent 4, CD4. This is the good stuff that actually develops the silver and forms the color dyes in your film. This is the important part, and it's stored separately for good reason. This is because once it's dissolved, and especially when stored at elevated pH, it is very prone to oxidation, i.e. it's a very good reducing agent, which is why we use it for development. Keeping it separate and at a moderate pH maximizes the shelf life. Next, Blix Part A lists just acetic acid at 0.5% to 2%, which is an organic acid added for pH adjustment, keeping the Blix acidic. The actual blixing process increases pH over time as you reuse the Blix, and this makes the blixing process slower, which is why the Blix time needs to be extended so much when you get towards the end of the lifetime of one of these kits. Adding in a little bit of acid keeps that pH lower a bit longer and keeps it effective for a couple more rolls. Then Blix Part B has sodium metabisulfite, shown here under a less common name, at 5 to 10%. This is a mild reducing agent and an antioxidant, but not potent enough to interfere with the actual bleaching process, which itself is an oxidative process. Then acetic acid at 0.5 to 2% is a weak acid as before, and potassium hydroxide at about 0.5% to 2% as well is a strong base, whose specific purpose here isn't entirely clear to me. It could be just added for solubility reasons, maybe the sodium metabisulfite dissolves better at higher or lower pH, and then they adjust the pH to a different pH for storage. I'm just guessing there. But you might notice that none of those ingredients are a bleach or a fixer. And this is where the real annoying thing, the real problem I have with this SDS is, and one of the things that absolutely destroyed my brain, because again, this is not a searchable PDF, I had to scroll everywhere. They have Blix Part A, Blix Part B, and then a fix section. So 3 concentrates described in the SDS, even though there are only 2 in the box, and the fix concentrate in the SDS contains a bleach but not a fix. This is something that I cannot abide by. I know the SDS isn't something a lot of people are going to look at, but that is completely unacceptable. The actual fix section then describes pentasodium pentatate, the sodium salt of DTPA, at about 2 to 3%, and this is half of our active bleaching agent. DTPA and EDTA bind metal ions, as I mentioned, but very strongly bind to iron in the +3 oxidation state, called ferric iron. When bound in this way and under an acidic condition at low pH, the ferric ion is actually a very potent oxidant, oxidizing the developed metallic silver back to ionic silver, in which case the ferric iron is reduced to ferrous iron, forming ferrous EDTA, and this enables the Blix to remove these silver ions with the fixer. Ammonium bisulfite at 2 to 5% is an antioxidant preservative, again maintaining the shelf life in this careful balance and dance between reduction and oxidation. And lastly, aqueous ammonia at 2 to 5% again forms ammonium hydroxide in solution, another type of base. And still no fixer disclosed anywhere in here. There is obviously logically ammonium thiosulfate added into this, and I'll explain in a moment why it's ammonium thiosulfate specifically, but just come on. To live out like the core ingredient, one of the core ingredients, and then put one in the wrong section and create a new section to put it in, it's an absolute disaster, and I'm really disappointed in this. And I have emailed Rollei just to complain about this, and if they respond to me by the time this video goes live, I'll add something in. And then lastly, the stabilizer concentrate. Ethoxylated isotridecanol at 3 to 5% is a greasy surfactant that can presumably act similar to PhotoFlow as your wetting agent, and it might be why so many people find using a dedicated wetting agent unnecessary if using the stabilizer. And then a mixture of methyl isothiazolinone and methyl chloroisothiazolinone, also called MIT and MCI respectively, typically sold under the name Cathon or Cathon as this mixture, totaling well less than 0.1%, acts as an antimicrobial biocide, protecting the film against bacterial and fungal growth long term. This is also specifically why you shouldn't be washing the film after the stabilizer bath, or you lose that protection. So there are obviously some very glaring omissions in the SDS that I will come back to later, but I want to talk about the whole potassium ammonium thing briefly. Sodium ions actually slow down the bleaching process, whether it's a dedicated bleach in a 3-bath kit or a 2-bath kit with a Blix, as shown here. So if you have a buildup of sodium ions in your Blix every time you put a roll through, because there's no wash between the developer step and the Blix step, so there's going to be a little bit of developer carryover, you're going to accumulate sodium, if there were sodium ions, and you would slow down the Blix to an absolute crawl, and it probably wouldn't have the capacity to do the job properly. Even with a dedicated bleach or even an RA bleach, it's going to slow down significantly. So the use of potassium salts means you can bypass that, even though the potassium salts cost a lot more, maintaining good performance of the developer without using the sodium salts. But why ammonium in the Blix then? Well, ammonium salts would be the ideal, but aside from cost, the high pH of the C-41 developer, pH 10, means the ammonium salts would be deprotonated to the corresponding ammonia. And that would liberate ammonia, which would interfere with the development process in various ways. You know, having that much ammonia, I wouldn't want to be handling that at home quite easily. You know, ammonia is pretty corrosive and noxious to breathe in. So they have ammonium salt in the Blix, which is acidic and at a low pH, where the generation of ammonia is not a concern. And that's that level of attention to detail that I absolutely love with this kind of stuff, you know? Choosing the right ion at the right time, balancing cost and performance, while also thinking about relatively tertiary or secondary things like the implications for pH over time. I love this kind of stuff. Used as instructed, the 1 litre kit can develop 12 to 16 rolls of 120 film or 36 exposure 35mm film, with a corresponding increase in time as you reuse the developer due to the accumulation of bromides and other salts, along with oxidation of the developer itself. And the same for the Blix, as the pH increases with use, slowing it down. The instructions state a max capacity of 16 rolls only if developing slower films, and a max capacity of 12 rolls if you're using higher ISO films of over ISO 400. This does not mean that the kit just suddenly stops working after 12 to 16 rolls, but results becomes significantly more inconsistent and you're going to see a lot more color shift. This boils down to basically what's acceptable for you. I already mentioned that reusing the developer in home development like this is not up to C-41 spec anyway. But usually with these manufacturer recommendations, they're saying you will get good, consistent results for X many rolls, and the developer and everything will still work after that, but you're going to see significant variation. What I tend to do is, if I have weird or expired or particularly pushed film, I use those at the end of the lifetime of the kit where expecting color shifts is, you know, where I am expecting color shifts. You know, if I'm pushing film, I'm not expecting normal colors anyway, but if I've shot a roll of Ektar, I want good colors, so I'll do that first. So there is a little bit of planning involved potentially. But I've seen people get in excess of like 30, 35 rolls with C-41 kits, 1 litre kits, albeit with absolutely atrocious results in many cases, and they complain about thin negatives and color casts. So it really is up to you, but I would stay within the manufacturer's recommendations if you actually care about your film. The shelf life of the unopened concentrates, whose components are separated specifically to maximize shelf life, is 2 years. I always keep at least one of these kits lying around just because they are there for such a long time and they are perfectly good. This one's about 8 months old. I got it about 8 months ago. I have another one that's just arrived to replace this one, knowing that I was going to use it. And as much as I prefer the 3-bath kits personally, having this with its supremely long shelf life is worth so much to me. It's likely only relevant with the 5 litre kit size because splitting the concentrates is quite difficult if you don't know what you're doing, but the shelf life of the concentrates once opened in partially filled bottles is around 3 months. And the shelf lives of the working solutions are much shorter, stated to be 6 weeks for the color developer and 8 weeks for the bleach and stabilizer in full, tightly sealed bottles, or 2 and 4 weeks respectively in partially filled bottles. Documentation is the new thing I want to bring into the fold here, because the level of documentation and the quality of it you get with different kits varies wildly. I mean, there is some recent discussion about the Cinestill E6 kit, and forgetting about the results with Noah's video, just looking at the documentation, it gives me a headache every single time the way they break that down. So I want to kind of shed some light on my general thoughts on how good the documentation with these kits is, and just point out some things that are either explained poorly or that are technically incorrect or just generally need a comment. The way this manual reads to some people is as if you can only use the kit specifically for batches of 4 rolls, 3 to 4 times over, and that's not the case. They constantly refer to this as steps. For example, when saying you shouldn't do 16 rolls of high-speed film, they say you should only do 3 steps and not 4. You can do batches of whatever size you want. It doesn't have to specifically be batches of 4. When it says that the stabilizer step must be carried out externally, that means, for example, if you're using a rotary processor, do this last step in a separate benchtop tank. Rotary processing the stabilizer will foam the hell out of it and you'll have a great time cleaning your machine. One thing I really do dislike is the implication that standard and rapid processing methods at 38 and 45 degrees C are for rotary processing only, which is ideal, don't get me wrong, but it is by no means mandatory, and literally immediately after this in the manual, they give you instructions for the agitation pattern when using this with a regular Patterson or whatever equivalent tank. Lastly, I would like to see it to be more explicitly clear that the pre-warm step is pre-warming the tank, not a pre-wash with at temperature water. Some people do swear by pre-washing basically anything they develop, but if Rollei are going to tell you to do what Kodak tell you to do, they should be more explicit that you are preheating the outside of the tank without water in the tank just to get it up to temperature so that when you pour the developer in, it doesn't massively cool down, which does have a negative effect on development. I was torn between a 2 or a 3 for documentation, but the manual it's not perfect, but there are no glaring omissions. But that whole thing with the SDS means it definitely gets a 2 out of 3 because that is an atrocious omission, the way they handled the Blix there. And there are a good few small improvements I would make to the manual, but again, it's by no means terrible. You could definitely process stuff, no problem with this. I learned home C-41 processing using this kit, and it was totally fine. You just might have to reread it a few times to really understand it. As always, a reminder that the SDS refers to the product as you receive it, not as you use it, unless a dedicated secondary SDS is provided. So here the SDSs are talking about the liquid concentrates in the bottles, but I am going to buck the trend and speak about them collectively because even though you have to handle the concentrates every time to prepare the working solutions, you can use them multiple times. And it just, when I started writing this video, I did do them all separately and it just made for an undigestible wall of text. And I'm going to compromise for the sake of people being able to actually intake this information in any kind of meaningful way. Starting with the developer then. Section 2 describes the risk of severe skin burns and eye damage, that it's suspected of causing cancer, there's a possibility of an allergic skin reaction, and it is toxic to aquatic life with long-lasting effects. Section 4 describes first aid with the usual basics but with somewhat greater potential severity. The likelihood of skin contact is relatively high with some of these things, like the Blix as I'll come back to, but it's also the fact that we're using C-41 chemicals at a lot higher temperature than we are with black and white chemicals. 20 degrees doesn't sound like a huge difference, but when it comes to chemical reactivity, that can be a trigger point for a lot of reactions, and it just means that whatever risks are there, if they read the same in the C-41 SDS and a black and white SDS, the risk is going to be higher with C-41 because of the working temperature. In Section 6, for all concentrates, we're told to use PPE and avoid discharge down the drain, which is more of a concern for the raw parts B and C than for Part A, though Part A does warn about the risk of slipping on spills, but that's more of a factory issue. We don't really get enough Part A in the bottle to be concerned about that at home. Section 8 is more or less the same for all 3 components and recommends gloves, providing an industrial spec that we don't need to be concerned with, and specifically warns against using natural rubber gloves. I always recommend powder-free nitrile gloves in general because they are the best for general chemical protection at home, and being powder-free, they're generally more acceptable for people with skin conditions. Safety specs are honestly a must here, and ventilation is definitely recommended for the Blix, as we'll come back to, but it is part of the kit, so I would recommend ventilation in general for the whole process. Section 11 mainly points out that Part A presents risks of eye and skin burns, though in the working solution that risk is significantly reduced, and that parts B and C may cause an allergic skin reaction, and that the HAS is suspected of causing cancer. In brief, the developer gets a 2 out of 3 for safety. Moving on to the Blix, there's nothing in Section 2 for Blix Part A, but Part B notes serious eye damage and skin irritation. Section 4 is quite sparse in both cases because it's not really talking about the actual Blix components, and Section 6 tells you to wear standard PPE, mop up spills that occur at home with an absorbent material. Something like paper towel is totally fine for home use. And it also mentions using breathing apparatus, but for home use, just work in a well-ventilated area. Section 8 is much the same as for the developer, arguably giving a lot of useful information that is irrelevant for home use. Section 11 points out the hilariously high LD50 values for parts A and B, both on par with or significantly higher, meaning safer than sucrose, table sugar, with no specific toxicological hazards to be worried about. Then for the bleach component of the fix, which again is marked as a fixer in the SDS, Section 2 talks about corrosion in the form of serious eye damage as well as skin irritation. Section 4, Section 6, and Section 8 all say nothing we haven't already covered before, so you can pause and have a look if you wish. And Section 11 notes no specific toxicological problems, mostly just reiterating the risk of serious eye damage. The Blix will also get a 2 out of 3 for safety, but with a very important caveat that has an impact on safety that I'll come back to in the handling section. Now moving on to the stabilizer. Section 2 notes serious eye damage, aquatic toxicity, and the possibility of an allergic skin reaction. Section 4 describes the usual first aid. Section 6 is the same as all the others, and Section 8 basically tells you to practice standard chemical safety. Don't eat when you're using it, and don't drink it. Pretty standard. Section 11 then notes the very safely high LD50 value and the lack of any specific toxicity concerns. So overall, the stabilizer gets a 2 out of 3 for safety, and it's 2s all around. I honestly expected a lot worse before I really dove in to actually write this video. I always thought that C-41 developer was super dangerous, and it kind of isn't. The dangers associated with the concentrates are definitely there, and as I mentioned, you have to handle the concentrates every time you prepare working solutions to do whatever batch of C-41 processing you want to do, but the working solutions are much more tame by comparison. Compared to a lot of black and white developers we've looked at in this series, this is very tame. It's by no means perfectly safe, but it is a lot better than I expected. Compared to something like D76, you know that stupid meme of the wolf and the dog? You know, that's kind of how I see D76 and the C-41 developer. The C-41 developer could still bite you, but it's definitely not as aggressive and rabid as the wolf. Moving on to handling and starting with the developer, Section 7 describes no special precautions for home use, just a storage temperature of between 5 to 25 degrees Celsius and noting to protect it from sunlight. Section 10 then notes the reaction with strong acids for part A, which will react with the carbonate to generate CO2 gas, which can cause bubbling or frothing, so you would get a potentially voluminous and growing spill, which would be a concern, but just don't expose it to strong acids and you're fine. Similarly, it describes the reaction with both acids and bases for part C, along with a general note about thermal decomposition that we don't need to be concerned with. And then the Blixen stabilizer have exactly the same descriptions here, so section 7 for both says there are no special precautions for home use, and the storage temperature should be about 5 to 25 C. Section 10 then describes no reactivity notes that are of any concern to us, making it very simple. And for the actual bleach, Section 7 mostly talks about the general storage temperature and storage conditions, but also mentions not to keep it in the same place as acids. Section 10 elaborates on this, noting that reaction with acids will generate sulfur dioxide and other noxious sulfurous gases, but also that reaction with strong bases will release ammonia, which itself is corrosive and noxious and not exactly something you want to breathe in. Why no scores here though? Because I want to describe some of the more interesting things that you need to know practically about using these chemicals, and then I will explain the scores based on those. The developer has a very short shelf life, and that is one of the famous issues with C-41 development at home. You have to accumulate enough film to be able to justify buying a kit and then developing it all before the developer goes bad. And you can store it for more than the recommended 2 to 4 weeks, no problem. I try to use it within 2 to 3 weeks, usually for best results, but there are people who are like storing it under argon in sealed bottles, in like extra bags, protective bags in a fridge, and getting way beyond 3 to 6 months even, and the results do work. So there are ways around it, but in general, the C-41 developer does not have a very long shelf life, and it's something you do need to be concerned about. I mentioned earlier, you kind of need to plan what you're going to do. I shoot a lot of film. I have the opportunity and I'm very lucky that I have the opportunity to shoot as much as I do for the relatively little amount of money I have to put into it. But it means that I have to keep rolls aside and not develop them and delay the gratification to make sure that I have enough to develop when I buy a kit, so I don't end up wasting the money by the developer going bad. The other main issue with C-41 development is temperature control, and I mentioned that, it's at a higher temperature than black and white processing, 38 degrees C or whatever that works out to in Fahrenheit, and that is very important. You can go higher, that's not really a problem. You will need to potentially reduce times a little bit, not a big deal. But unlike black and white processing, where if you're below 20 C, if you're at like 18 or 19, you can extend your development time a bit. That doesn't really work with the C-41 process. Any biochemists or biologists watching this will love this phrase and possibly perk their ears up. The C-41 process at temperature is diffusion limited. That means the rate of development cannot go higher than the physical motion of developer molecules in and out of the gelatin through the pores, which is one of the coolest things, and it's the goal of basically every enzyme engineering project on Earth. So what it means is, in practical terms, if you develop at less than 38 degrees C, you have your various emulsion layers with the cyan forming layer coated onto the base, with the magenta forming layer on top and the yellow forming layer on the top of that on the outside. By the time the cyan forming layer has fully developed or developed appropriately, the other two layers are going to be overdeveloped, giving you a relative lack of cyan in your image, which constitutes a relative lack of cyan in your negative, which gives you a relative lack of red in your image, giving you a sort of bluish greenish tint, a sort of teal cast to your images, which can be removed somewhat in scanning, But if you want to get good negatives, you want to be developing at 38C plus or minus, I think it's 0.15 to 0.2C. Very precise with your temperature control. Of course, there is the other aspect where all C-41 films go in the bucket for the same time, and that is very simple compared to black and white, where you might have to do 4 process runs for 4 different films. With C-41, you don't have to worry about that, so there is distinctly a trade-off there. Aside from generally having a short shelf life, there are 2 ways notably that the developer can be made to go bad. The first is with rotary processing, because if you're constantly aerating and rotating that tank, the developer will be oxidized at a higher rate. So if you're doing replenishment at home, you need to increase your replenishment rate versus if you're using a Patterson tank with replenishment. But if you're not using replenishment, you're not going to get the max capacity because you're going to make the developer go bad quicker, basically. The oxidation, is only part of the way the developer goes bad. It's the accumulation of byproducts being the other half. The other thing is that the only safe level of Blix contamination is 0. There are posts on forums and Reddit and whatever all the time about people who get completely blank negatives, and it's because they've got even the tiniest amount of Blix or bleach into their developer. The only safe level is 0, and it's something I want to look at some point, but if you get even a single drop into your developer, just assume the developer is dead, toss it, buy a new kit. Brendan and I always say, this is a bit of a privilege thing, just spend the money. Your photos are more important than the cost of buying another kit. That 30, 50 euros, whatever you spend on your color chemicals is less important than actually getting the photos and getting good negatives. If you're not sure, dump the developer. But you do really need to be careful with this because a lot of people get very chaotic when they're doing C-41 development at home because of the short development times, and that does lead to mistakes. That's a realistic, practical thing, and it does cause, heartbreak. It's always the word heartbreak when you see these posts online. So considering all of those things put together, some of them aren't that drastic, but when you put them all together, they're quite a big pile of painful things to deal with. The C-41 developer gets a 1 out of 3 for handling. On the Blix side then, the first and most important thing is that the Blixing process produces gas. You need to look up how to burp your tank or vent it. The burping is usually the more common term. Every tank will have some kind of a bulge to the lid that can be pushed inwards. So if you're using a sealed tank like a Patterson tank or a Jobo tank for direct inversion processing, you're going to want to make sure that part of the lid is pushed all the way in to decrease the internal volume so you have headspace that the gas can push into. Because if you don't, the gas can actually push the lid off the tank and lead to what's called a Blix explosion. And you don't want that Blix spreading all over you, your kitchen, your equipment, whatever your working space is. That is not something you want to deal with, and I see this happen all the time. Even with rotary processors, if people are using a magnetic base, you see the lids pop off, and suddenly, with the tank going sideways, you have Blix shooting across the room. You really don't want to have to deal with that. That's one nice advantage of rotary processing. You do have the disadvantage with the developer, but with a cog lid, if you're using a rotary processor, the tank is never actually sealed, so you don't have to worry about the gas building up because it will just naturally vent out. There's a lot more discussion about this online, and I do strongly recommend looking into this because I can't really talk too much about it here in this already very long video, but it's something you definitely need to be very mindful of in terms of handling Blix solution. The other 2 things are just compromises because you're using Blix. As I mentioned, it gets very slow with reuse, up to like 15 minutes for just the Blix step when you get towards the end of its life. This is where the 3-bath kit comes in for me. Okay, I'm doing 2 steps instead of 3, but I can do an entire 3-bath C-41 kit process run in less than the time it takes to do just the Blix once this kit gets old. So it depends on how much you value having 3 bottles of chemicals lying around versus your time and the general complexity of having 3 steps, especially considering that in a 3-bath kit, especially an RA kit, the bleach is very fast, so you might not want to deal with that, which is understandable, but you do need to be aware that this gets to be a very long process towards the end of its shelf life. The other thing is that Blix is inherently a compromise. There are a lot of discussions about this online, but it's a known thing that the fixing step works just fine with all of the bleached silver, but not all of the silver gets effectively bleached in a Blix compared to a 3-bath kit. This doesn't affect the archival quality of the negs, which is something people often say, and I think I have said once in the past and haven't stopped since learning the correct answer, because whatever silver remains in the film is metallic silver, not ionic, so the fixing goes to completion, but the bleach doesn't. So you're basically doing a partial bleach bypass, no matter what you do, which has negative effects, in theory, on your contrast and grain and sharpness. The extent of which I've personally never noticed, and it might be worth doing a side-by-side at some point to have a look, actually. Let me know if you're interested about that in the comments down below. We were talking about this in the Naked Photographers Discord relatively recently, and the best analogy that I was able to come up with is making an iced coffee. If you have hot water to extract the coffee and then you put it on ice to make it like an iced Americano, that's your bleach and fix. You do the hot water and then you do the cold water. But a Blix is more like if you just put the coffee grounds into room temperature water. You don't get the potent extraction of the hot water and you don't get the refreshing cool taste of the ice. You get something in between that isn't quite as perfect. Now, in the case of the Blix, as I mentioned, the fixing works perfectly fine and archival is great, but the bleaching isn't as perfect. So it's not a perfect analogy, but I hope it kind of gets the point across that there is some level of a compromise here. So overall, I'm going to give the Blix a 2 out of 3 for handling, but do read up on Blix explosions and make sure you're prepared for it. PPE, face, apron, whatever else, gloves, and just have some kind of a plan for what you can do if it happens to you. It's not very likely, it's not super common, but it definitely does happen more than it should if people were well prepared for it. And this is the kind of thing that should be documented in the general documentation with the instruction manual for these kits that isn't. So that's another reason, I guess, that I retroactively would make sure this gets a 2. For the stabilizer, there's basically nothing to say other than not agitating it excessively so it doesn't become super frothy, so I'll give it a 3 out of 3 for handling. Dead easy. Starting with the developer, Section 12 notes nothing of note with specific environmental or ecological concerns, but does specifically say not to let it into the waste stream and calls it highly water endangering. Section 13 says that in bulk it can't go down the drain, but small portions can with extensive dilution, and it provides a lot of detailed information about disposal actually, providing EU regulatory waste classes if your recycling centre needs those, as well as explicit instruction that the water is the cleaning agent of choice. Like I mentioned earlier, I expected worse from the C-41 developer, and I'm kind of impressed here. What I personally do when I'm finished with the kit and need to get rid of it is when I finish the last roll, while it's still warm, I spike it with a ton of toilet bleach, like 50 to 100 mils, and I'll leave it there while it cools down. I'll shake it and agitate it periodically with venting to prevent gas buildup, and that will allow the oxidative destruction of the CD4 and the HAS, which are the two most environmentally concerning things here. And at that point, it is safe to put down the drain. But the working solution directly after use, and certainly the concentrates, should never go directly down the drain. That would have to go to a recycling center or other equivalent kind of facility. So I'll give it a 2 out of 3 for disposal, because you can get rid of it at home without any guilt on your conscience, but you do have to take a step to do so. For the Blix, because the Part A and Part B documentation are so bad, I'm just going to look at the so-called fix section, which contains the active bleaching agent, the DTPA salt. Section 12 notes no specific environmental or ecological concerns, but calls it water endangering. DTPA and EDTA and these kind of chelating agents do have environmental impacts, and a lot of companies avoid using EDTA and DTPA for that specific reason. And then Section 13 basically describes the same kind of information as seen with the developer, which is nice to have. One of the other big weaknesses of using Blix is for home disposal. Any fixer, once it's used, will have silver salts in it, and silver salts are environmentally concerning themselves. Not described in the SDS, but they do accumulate in the fixer over time. That's the point. But you have to desilver your fixer if you want to dispose of it down the drain at home. But you can't use the steel wool method that is oh so common, where you displace metallic iron into the solution to make iron salts and turn these silver salts into metallic silver, coating the steel wool, metallic silver being safe to put in the regular garbage can, the bin, regular trash, because that doesn't work in the presence of Blix with the DTPA bleach. Because if you form metallic silver, the point of that bleach in the Blix is that it oxidizes metallic silver back to ionic silver. So you're never going to ever get rid of all of the silver by the steel wool methods. You'd have to do something else entirely. And that is very annoying and difficult to have to deal with. So you're going to have to look into a different method of desilvering the Blix to get rid of it, or just accumulate it and take it to a recycling center. It's not like a regular black and white fixer where if you desilver it, you can put it down the drain. So I'm gonna have to give the Blix a 1 out of 3 for disposal. And lastly, for the stabilizer, Section 12 points out that it's highly water endangering, but Section 13 says that, just like before, with sufficient dilution, small quantities can be disposed of down the drain. This is a common thing with all kind of surfactants, like if you were to drink dish soap, that would be bad for you, but a little bit of dish soap in a sink full of water can go down the drain without issue. As someone pointed out in a comment on one of the older videos recently, you know, it is a slippery slope to go down the whole dilution is the solution to pollution kind of line of thinking. But I try to strike a balance in these videos between what's reasonably practicable for a normal person at home and what is technically perfectly correct in an ideal world. In this case, I wouldn't be worried about this. You know, when I dispose of the stabilizer, I simply dilute it down to about 5 liters or 6 liters in my mop bucket and then dispose of that portion-wise over the course of an hour or so. And that's not a big deal to do once every few months. I wouldn't pour the liquid concentrate straight down the drain because that might cause excessive frothing, and even the working solution, I wouldn't dispose of it all in one go. But with a bare minimum of thinking and patience, I think it's okay to give it a 3 out of 3 for disposal. These 1 litre kits cost €48 for the box, which means you're talking about €3 to €4 per roll. If you get the larger 5 litre kit, they're about €90, so you're talking €1 to €1.50. C-41 development is inherently more expensive, and I base my gauge for this off the typical price that I see around Europe of something in the region of €3 to €5 per roll. Typically, I'd expect to pay €3.50 to €5 here in Dublin. And in that sense, this kit is saving me a little bit of money, but not a huge amount. But for me, it's the versatility of being able to push and pull and do whatever else I want, minus bleach bypassing. It just, you know, provides a lot of extra value and being able to do it whenever I want. And again, as I've said 1,000 times, I'm a chemist. I enjoy doing this kind of thing. The 5 litre kit is obviously significantly cheaper, but I've never seen anyone actually buy one of those, as I mentioned earlier. But up until recently, this was quite a normally priced kit on the market. But now there are a lot of cheaper, newer kits like the Adox C-Tech C-41 kit. That's €12 cheaper for 1 litre kit. So while acknowledging that C-41 is definitely going to have a higher price threshold, contextually, this is in the market as it stands, this is the most expensive option out there right now. The only thing of a similar price is the Bellini C-41 RA kit, which has certain significant advantages over this kit, albeit shelf life not being one of them. So I think I'm going to have to give this a 1 out of 3 for cost. As always, before I tally up the scores, I have to give a huge shout out and thanks to the folks at the Photoshop.ie who've sponsored this video and video series on photographic chemical safety. I wouldn't be able to do this without their support. Whether you need film, chemicals, equipment, accessories, or anything else to get your film development or darkroom processing up and running, the Photoshop.ie has you covered with highly competitive prices, making them Ireland's premier online retailer and being highly competitive on the European market. Thanks to the folks at the Photoshop.ie, as always, for their support. And now, let's tally up the scores. The Rollei Colorchem C-41 kit gets a 2 out of 3 for documentation, 2, 2 and 2 out of 3 for safety, averaging to 2 of course, 1, 2 and 3 out of 3 for handling, averaging to 2 again, and 2, 1 and 3 out of 3 for disposal, averaging again of course to 2, and a 1 out of 3 for cost, for a total score of 9 out of 12, but with specific ones that you need to be concerned about. I think this is a fair way to represent it, giving an overall rating for the safety of the kit, while still pointing out the specific details about what parts need extra care or extra handling concerns, this kind of thing. If you have any feedback on this kind of matrix, please do let me know in the comments down below, because I'm trying to find a balance between giving a concise overall rating while still providing the necessary information. The Rollei Colorchem C-41 kit is one I am very happy with, and I've developed close to 60 or 70 rolls over the last couple of years using just these kits. And even though the Bellini kit is my default nowadays for speed reasons more than anything else, these kits don't let me down. I keep mentioning the shelf life, and it's always nice just to have that backup. Even if I would prefer the results with a 3-bath kit, I've never noticed any issues with the residual silver from a 2-bath from a Blix, and I think I've kind of talked myself into looking at that at some point, but that might be a bit down the line. So let me know if that's actually something people think is worth looking into. The kits, you know, it was easier to recommend this kit before the Adox kit came out, because if you're buying it online, the cost of shipping is going to be more or less ballpark the same either way. But the fact is, the Adox kit is only really available from Photo Impex. This is going to be available from a lot of local retailers, whether it's the Photoshop or another in-person brick and mortar store, which means you're not paying the cost of shipping, and this can actually be cheaper than a lot of its competitors. So although the base cost does get it a poor rating, the practical availability might outweigh that for a lot of people in a lot of situations. And generally, I can see a lot of people, you know, who like to support their local brick and mortar stores rather than buying online when they can. In those kind of cases, this kit might actually be a really good choice. Being a C-41 kit means it does have the general trappings of a C-41 kit, like the shelf life of the developer, the risk of contamination, and then the fact that it's a 2-bath kit, you have to worry about the potential of a Blix explosion, which, again, to emphasize, is not a very common thing, but it's something you do need to be prepared of. It's a very specific thing you need to be mindful of with a 2-bath kit. So, you know, I have to acknowledge them while still being aware of the fact that they are present with any C-41 kit, and they're not specifically negatives associated with this, they're part of the C-41 process. So it's hard to strike a balance there, right? I'm really happy with the results I've gotten with this kit, but there are various things you need to be mindful of. If there's something specific you think that I've not given enough emphasis to in this general video format, which is adjusted from the black and white format, do let me know in the comments down below. I did manage to get this done in one session, which I'm quite surprised about. I am very tired, but I'm getting there. We're close to 100 gigs of raw footage at this point, which is going to kill my poor hard drive. And yeah, like, the veil is coming down again. This did take a lot of work to get right, and it was in places a bit sloppy. I can already tell compared to what I would normally like. I like to be, you know, I'm quite a technically minded person. But if being 10% more sloppy means getting the video out, I'd rather do that than worry about perfection and then never release it. That was how I started the YouTube channel in the first place. With my old videos, they're atrocious by any standard, but especially the standards I'm working at now. But to look back and be like, yeah, I still made the video. The information is out there, and that's good enough for the most part. So I'm happy. I hope you're happy. Do let me know. I'm getting very relaxed and conversational now because the mask has come off. And I do need to go and probably have a nap. Get ready for this masterclass later. But yes, thank you very much for your time. Thank you again to the folks at the Photoshop.ie. I love this kit, even if it has improvements to be made. And again, I will add a note earlier in the video if Rollei get back to me about my complaints about the C-41 SDS, particularly about the Blix. So I think that's it for this video. Stay safe, and bye-bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shako1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.